speaker is Stephen Goodman. Stephen is Associate Dean for Clinical and Translational Research and Professor of Medicine and Health Policy and Research at Stanford University School of Medicine. He obtained his training in MHS in biostatistics and a PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins. And before joining Stanford in 2011, he was on the faculties of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and Public Health for 20 years, and he directed the Oncology Biostatistics Division there. He's been the editor of clinical trials and has served on a wide range of Institute of Medicine committees, most recently co-chairing the committee on ethical and scientific issues in studying the safety of approved drugs. He is co-director of the new Stanford Center on Meta Research, and he's interested in the determinants of truth of medical findings, scientific inference, evidence synthesis, comparative effectiveness research, and the ethics of clinical research. And Stephen's topic this morning is defining actionable evidence, science or politics. Stephen?
Thanks a lot. I was sorry I couldn't make it here yesterday, and on the plane over, I was worried. I mean, the reason I was really concerned about not being here yesterday was I was extremely worried that the clinical trial would be retired by today, and then I wouldn't have much to say. And then all sorts of things would be messed up. For example, my tie wouldn't any longer be relevant. You notice I wore my special Sackett tie. Maybe you can't tell what it is. Here I've blown it up for you there. What this is all the sort of nostrums and elixirs peddled around the turn of the century that whose harm or lack of efficacy actually stimulated indirectly the formation of the FDA. The other reason I was very concerned about the retirement of the clinical trials, because of course I edit this journal actually just for the next few months, and I just on Thursday I had to mock up the cover for this current issue, and I thought maybe we'd have to add that, maybe we'd have to shroud it in black. So you know, I'll have to get back to the publisher after today, but fortunately I did hear that we still had at least one day's lease on life. Now, I'm very slow about accepting invitations to talk that involve a lot of travel, but you know, I could never resist coming for something that celebrated and involved David, because David always wants to stir the pot, and of course, how much better could you stir the pot by saying, should we retire the clinical trial in an audience of mainly clinical trial acolytes and believers? So you know, you can't stir the pot any more than that. So I thought, great, I'll come here and I'll try to do the same. I'll say things that I would never say at an IOM or NIH meeting. So I'll say a few of those things again to stir the pot. So we'll start with this, the tale of two sillies. Here's the quote. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of clinical trials. It was the age of observational studies. It was the epoch of data mining. It was the epoch of pre-specification. It was the season of discovery. It was the season of decision. It was the spring of effectiveness. It was the winter of harms. We had truth before us. We had lies before us. We're all going direct to causality. We're all going direct the other way. In short, the period was the present period, and some of its noisiest funders and policymakers insisted on its being perceived for good or for evil with a superlative degree of scientific rigor. That's what I think I've heard so far today, but in many other places as well. So I'm going to talk about how this argument that we're talking about plays out in a variety of political and policy conversations. And one context, well, I'm going to talk about two reports. We'll see how much time I actually have. One is the study that was mentioned that I was involved in at the IOM, delivered to the FDA. I'll find out from Bob Temple if it was in any way useful. I suspect not, but we'll find out. But we had fun writing it. And then the second was work for PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Unit, the Research Institute, for which I've been working for the last few years. So I'm going to start first by talking about the PCORI methodology report. First of all, I just want to ask, how many people here know what PCORI is? How many people don't know what PCORI is? Interesting. Okay, I should have included those slides. So PCORI is well, I'll do it in context. So I had politics in my title, so here let's start with politics. A little headline a few years ago. Stunning upset, Brown captures the U.S. Senate in Massachusetts. So does anybody know why this might be loosely connected? Okay, so if you can speculate, give you 10 seconds. Here's the reason. 3 months later, the House passed something now called Obamacare. In Obamacare was the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Unit, Institute. Why do I keep saying that? Institute, which was a new institute previously intended to be titled the Comparative Effectiveness Research Institute, but the word comparative effectiveness managed to be slimed and dragged through the mud enough in the op-ed pages who likened it to anti-competitiveness because it might prove that one drug or treatment was actually better than another, so you couldn't sell one. So it was then relabeled the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Unit because how could anybody be against something being patient-centered? But the important thing to know about this, aside from the closeness of the vote, was how it happened. So again, if a fair number of you don't know what PCORI is, you almost certainly don't know what happened, and this being Canada, you wouldn't want to know what happened. It's so ugly, almost as ugly as what's happening today in Washington. So what happened was, with the election of Scott Brown, that destroyed the veto-proof majority in the Senate, and the bill that that legislated the ACA, or the Obamacare, that was passed from the Senate to the House, they were terrified to return it to the Senate. They couldn't amend it in any way. Because if the House amended it, then what you usually have is a conference committee hashes things out, smooths things out, makes it perfect, or makes it less imperfect. But what happened was there was enormous pressure to just pass it as is. So a lot of things that are put into bills with the expectation that a lot of careful thinking people would sand it out in the mix. That didn't happen. So what we have is a bill that is an object of some contention, as you may have heard today. And it's really interesting even to see how this appears in the Congressional Register. Notice how big the word Congress is up there. Let's see if I can get look at it, how big that is. And down here is the actual name of the act in this is not showing it, in teeny tiny letters. Let's see if, there we are. Teeny tiny letters there, entitled the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. But Congress gets a big word. The other interesting word is an act. Now they're performing a certain act on this Obamacare, and it can't even be mentioned what that is. So anyway, PCORI was formed, and it's an institute that's designed to fund research looking at the real-world comparison of real-world options using outcomes that patients care about. So that's basically it. You might say, why not the NIH, why not AHRQ? And the fact is they do fund a lot of this. But in fact, arguably, these days, given the budgets, more than PCORI. But this is PCORI's singular focus. This is what it's trying to do. It's trying to do things differently. Now, one thing that's quite interesting about its construction is in the Act, they said that we should have a methodology committee. And I would say it's probably, let's see, are we getting, there we go. It may be the only research funding agency that has methodologists at really the very top of the agency. There are two boards that were established, the governing board and the methodology committee. That was it. In fact, for about a year, there was no staff. It was just the board and just the methodology committee. You didn't have an executive director. We had no staff. We were the agency with $10 million to start and now $500 million a year. Actually, we heard a very funny story the other day about how they started. When the first meeting of the board, they said, do we have any money? Somebody said, well, I think we do. It's in the Treasury. They said, well, how do we get it? And he said, well, you have to get a tax ID number. You get a checking account. They said, do we have a checking account? No, we didn't have a checking account. So the chairman of the board went to a bank and tried to open, and he showed his letter. And he said they were afraid that he was embezzling money from the government. He said, I want the $10 million. They said, do you have a tax ID? He said, no. They said, well, give us your Social Security number. This is literally true. And he had to get a loan from a company to get a lawyer to file a tax ID so they could get access to their own money. So this is how things started. But anyway, this is the methodology committee, and we're charged with a few things. So one is to develop methodologic standards for research. And that's not the subject of this talk, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Maybe we can talk about it in the subsequent discussion. The other thing we had to do was create a translation table. This is in the legislation. Translation table that is designed to provide guidance and act as a reference for the board to determine research methods that are most likely to address each specific research question. Now you see why it might be relevant for today. So we actually weren't sure what a translation table was. So what do you do when you have something, you're legally obligated to produce it, and you don't know what it is? Well, you Google it. So that's what we did. Okay, so this is the first page of the Google, and what you see is genetic code, translation table, used when cuttering for translation only when a uniform title plus line. No, that's not going to do it. Genetic codes, convert data. No, that's not going to do it. ASCII tables, translation tables, myth and reality. Maybe that's it. No, that was more computer speak. Okay, so didn't work. There was really nothing there. So second thing, you go to PubMed. Okay, so PubMed. First, clinical experience in carbon ion scattering. No. Rod groups and their settings. No. Oh, number 3, this looks a little hopeful. The right kind of evidence integrating, measuring, and making it count in health equity research. Very suspicious capitalization there. So Journal of Urban Health. So we looked at that, and it's really how to repackage knowledge so people, policymakers, and others will know what it means. So that wasn't it either. So then you thought, okay, let's put in translation table and comparative effectiveness research into PubMed. Nothing. Okay, so let's go back to Google and do that. Okay, so you get, the same sort of thing. LC translation, cutter translation. Oh, look at this. Oh, no. Request for information. You know it's bad when the first link you get is your own RFP asking if anybody knows what it is. So this is what we found. We found that our own request to the world to ask them to comment on a translation table is it. So this is a problem. Actually, I have to say I lied. It's not that there was nothing there when we put this into Google, is that it was on page 2. So whoever goes to page 2. But here we have at the bottom of page 2 an article by a member of our audience, Sean Tunis, who spoke yesterday. And this is an article that mentions the translation table. So let's look into this article. And there, section 4.1, it says, I'll read the beginning, the range of potential CER questions, the methods most suitable for answering them, suggests that the goal of this next phase of CER should include developing a more systematic evidence on best practices that could be applied to the entire portfolio of CER methods. Eventually, it will be useful to be able to complete a translation table similar to the basic draft provided in Table 2. So this makes you extremely eager to see Table 2. But you also wonder, well, just because it was mentioned here, does that mean it's the same thing that's in the legislation? Is this what, okay. Well, there is a hint in the article that maybe there's a connection. This is in the article. Based in part on the contents of a draft version of this paper provided to the congressional staff in June 2009, the new CER Institute created in the health reform legislation, PCORI will include a methodology committee with responsibility for developing methodologic guidance and standards for CER. So just in case you think that a lot of academic work just goes in the literature to die, not so here. This had a direct pipeline into the policy arena. And what's interesting in policy circles is that, once an idea gets there, it can get into legislation. It can get $100 million behind it. It can get amazing things can happen for good or for ill. The critical thing is to get it into the policy conversation. And this did. And this did. So what was that Table 2? Well, this was just a draft, but it was the kind of thing that many of you might have in your books. Pragmatic clinical trials, a description, one paragraph, an example, advantages. Because these trials are designed to meet the needs of decision makers, the results tend to be more generalizable, the outcomes more useful to patients and physicians, making tough clinical choices, and the trial maintains all or much of the scientific rigor of traditional RCTs, and it goes down. Cluster RCTs, Bayesian trials, N-of-1 trials, delayed design trials, etc. So this was our guidance, and clearly Sean and others wanted us to go further. Now I have to say we struggled with going further because we felt that it was so difficult to display all the trade-offs, all the judgments, all the choices that are made in choosing these designs. So there are many, many, many things I can say. I'm just going to really cut to the chase. Basically what we decided to do is to set up a framework. We said that the background for choice is the prior evidence, including mechanism, and by the way, the answer to the question, I believe, in how you judge about unmeasured confounders is how much you think you know about mechanism, which is something that's very difficult to talk about or difficult to know, and we don't like talking about it in EBM because we've declared that off the reservation for evidence. And also the decisions that the research is intended to inform. Then we have the typical PCOTS research question, but that's not enough. Then we have all these other things that are intrinsic and extrinsic, issues of internal validity, issues of external validity, which I think is often missing from these conversations. As soon as you put external validity into the conversation and you're talking about mean squared error from the truth and not bias, choices become very complicated. If you're trading off a little bit of bias for a lot of generalizability, you're closer to the truth. So bias is not the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. And in statistics, we do that all the time. We use lots of biased estimators because they're on average closer to the truth. So if we're just talking about bias, we've missed half the ball game here. Precision, issues around heterogeneity and risk or benefit, ethical dimensions of the study. And one thing I should also mention here, which really goes into the heterogeneity, is the relevance of context. We shouldn't get too focused on drugs that are not so dependent on context except through the delivery system. When you're talking about changes in care systems, safety measures, these things, you go from hospital to hospital, division to division, all of a sudden the context really matters. And a randomized controlled trial that requires the same mechanism in all people doesn't necessarily apply with the same generality, because you have a different mechanism, you have a different way the intervention is metabolized in every place. Very complicated. Extrinsic, time urgency. If it's a rapidly changing technology, we can't wait 10 years to know. So we have to get some evidence, logistical considerations, feasibility of collecting information for participants, number available, study complexity, and finally, again, an often ignored issue, the data availability, quality, and completeness. The other thing I didn't mention here is the analytic. So this became a figure. So this is all those things in a figure. This doesn't tell you much. And we had lots and lots of angst about, does this satisfy the terms of the legislation? And finally, we think we've landed somewhere. This is not yet published, so don't take it from here and don't say that I said it. And but this is really crude because it is crude, but basically we're coming up with something like from Consumer Reports. Everybody understands, and the important thing about Consumer Reports is everybody understands that those rankings and those evidence tables that they produce, you know, when you're looking at a vacuum cleaner and they look at power, efficiency, convenience, affordability, that it doesn't tell you which one to buy. That you have to sit there and think really hard about what matters to you. And that every home might take one of those tables and you might buy a different vacuum cleaner. So using the same sort of language, and we put everything here on a table. The decision, the evidence, the gaps, the PCOTS question, the anticipated effect size, which actually is quite important, and we've heard a lot about that. And then we have the dimensions of that framework here laid out in a table. Analytic approach, the characteristics of the data with regard to exposures, covariates, and outcomes, the internal validity, the generalizability, the precision, the heterogeneity, the ethics, the logistics, the money, and the duration. All of these things matter in the choice, right? And here we have a design. And RCTs are not just all RCTs. Point of care using EHR data, a conventional RCT, where you construct a parallel care system, which is what makes them expensive. retrospective cohort using EHR data. And each one of these has a different, so red pointing up is good, solid, best, hollow, not as good. This is neutral, pointing down, black, not good, black, the worst. You look at a table like this and you see the trade-offs. Now, how we get from qualitative considerations to these arrows, a lot of work to be done there. But I think this shows you fairly the complexity of the choice and the foolishness at some level of talking in abstract terms in any situation about RCT versus observational study or these sort of binary choices. So the optimal design choice is specific to prior knowledge, including mechanism and natural history, the decision context, the question, the data sources, the analytic methods, external considerations, the overall research program, and the consequences of being wrong. So what are some of the emerging principles there? Well, one, keep the research question and the design separate. Sometimes arguments over design are really arguments over that question. Design has many elements beyond whether or not it is randomized, and I would say there's no formula, no algorithm that maps a design choice to a question, that the right people need to be in the room to balance the many competing design properties and aims. And to this purpose, we're actually going to modify the grant review process of PCORI to actually make it quite different than the NIH or ARC, which is to have a second level of methodologic review where a bunch of folks, it's very important that it's a bunch, not one statistician or one epidemiologist, because views vary on these matters, will work with grants that are proposed to be funded and work with them to improve them, not give them a pink sheet about what's wrong or what's right, but suggest maybe you should use an adaptive design, maybe you should use a different outcome here, maybe you should embed a certain kind of measurement here, et cetera, to really make the agency quite different. Now we'll see how successful that will be. So our final guidance in the report is the familiar overgeneralizations don't take into account developments in research methodology that make randomized studies more relevant, timely, and flexible. And related to Dean's last comment, the kinds of things that are going on today with new data systems and lowering the cost of trials and new informatics is really going to revolutionize trials. We're in 10 years, I predict we are not, I don't want to say we're not going to be doing trials the way we do them today, but a ton of trials are going to be done in a profoundly different way. They're going to be cheap compared to, they're going to be 5% of the cost of what we have right now, and they'll be embedded in clinical care, some of them, in ways that are almost seamless. Now, is that going to be the fabric of care? I don't think so, but we're going to get a lot closer. So in particular, the use of observational studies to make causal inference is also much stronger. So both the designs are coming together. Now, I would say this is the PCORI Awards just recently announced, and you won't see, this is the politics of it, you won't see randomized versus observational, although about 50% or more of the portfolio is in RCTs, and one of the very biggest investments is in RCT on prevention of falls. I think, so here are some questions, and I'm going to actually stop before I do the second report because we're sort of out of time, or maybe I'll give that a very short shrift. So first, did we answer the question? Actually, we haven't published it, so, but, and were we asked an answerable question? Was this answer useful? And how would you have answered the question? Did we fail or succeed? So I see I'm a little over time. Give me just 2 more minutes, and then I'll just do the other. So the other was a report that where we were given the following charge, and you will see it's quite similar. What are the strengths and weaknesses of various approaches to studying drug safety? And second, tell us what studies to do and in what order. And I will tell you, basically, we couldn't answer that very well either. First, we had a whole section on why scientists disagree with the same evidence in front of them. We thought that was very important to show that evidence does not directly drive decisions. And the FDA knows this very, very well. This is why they have these public meetings and lots of scientists disagree, but a lot of people don't understand it. So we have a table in there given all the reasons why, with all the identical data in front of a group of scientists, they're going to disagree. So you might want to look at that. It's entertaining and useful. Our primary recommendations were actually not about the choices, but about the processes used. And these had, and you can see them listed here, multidisciplinary teams, transparency, we mentioned Bayesian methods, and having starting early. And we said the same thing here. Perhaps it's not coincidental that I was on both. Invocation of broad principles that are inapplicable to a specific case. For example, that RCTs always provide the best evidence can sometimes impair investigation of drug harms. In any specific case, regulators need to have the input of a wide variety of experts who can make context-specific judgments. And we, in our list of decisions about whether to randomize, we list a lot of the things that we put in the PCORI report and that have been mentioned here. So, these are the final slides. The question of how valid observational studies are in the domain of both prevention and therapeutics is a pressing national concern, but RCTs do not escape the same questions. Many of the methods and philosophical questions about causal inference are now front and center. Policymakers and sometimes don't recognize that even, quote, purely scientific questions cannot be answered the same way by all scientists. We need processes that help decide what are the right questions, the values, and the trade-offs. And there seems to be an unending stream of forums in which the relative value of RCTs and observational studies are discussed in the abstract. This is part of stirring the pot. Many seem designed to encourage or to force social consensus about the relative value or lack thereof of certain class of designs for a vaguely specified purpose. And the question is, do these serve any purpose? So here's a guy delivering a report, and he says, before I read our committee's report, I must inform you that each of us will be submitting a dissent. So, should we cut down on meetings and expert committees? And I'll leave that question up there for the discussion.